So I'm Jordan.
Hi, Jordan.
I'm going to start with, so we're going to go through and talk about each little page of the zine, and we're going to have a lot of like stops where we stop and talk about things, and then some questions to consider at the end, and I'll write like questions to think about during the presentation on the board. But I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I would like to recognize all tribal nations, both federally and recognized federally and not recognized federally, because the federal government can't regulate indigeneity and home. As a settler on unceded territory, I would like to recognize the Coast Salish and Strait Salish First Nations, particularly the Lummi and Nooksack, whose traditional territories on which we are currently learning, working, and living. These peoples, all unique and independent, have been stewards of this land since time immemorial. And I think it's important to we've written that a bunch now, we've said it a bunch. We're currently working on the letter to Nassau, which is good. And we are currently working on the other ones. And they will actually be happening. So instead of just saying this over and over and over, but it is important to recognize. So I attempted to draw a wave on the front cover. Feel free to decorate it however you like. This was not my most polished work. It's okay.
It kind of looks like this too.
Yeah.
Is it first wave, second wave, third wave?
We will be talking about, yes, you can draw 4 waves on this if you want. So, first question, if you flip open, is what is ecofeminism? And so I wanted to write the definitions on there for you, but we can, if you want to just jot down some words as I talk about them, that works as well. I tried to leave little blanks in the zine for you to write whatever notes you want. There's also the back cover is also blank for you to write any notes you want. But I know it's not very much room, so if you also want to write whatever you want in your journal, I'd welcome you to do that. But so in the research I've done this quarter and last quarter about ecofeminism, I came up with about 4, there's kind of 4 different definitions, and they all kind of say the same thing. But the first one is it's a philosophical and political movement that combines ecological concerns with feminist ones, regarding both as resulting from male domination of society. So it's kind of looking, for me, at least the way I see it, is it's looking at that intersection or the different ways that multiple groups are similarly oppressed by different oppressive systems. And yeah, I will in a little. I'll just go through the other definitions real quick, but for me it's like looking at the way different oppressive systems affect different groups in similar ways. And I'll jot some key terms on the board, but over the course of right now, you're kind of going to be reflecting on what it means to you and what your own definition is, so that's kind of just the definition I've come to right now. Yeah. So another one is that it's a lens through which we can view human relations to one another and to the earth. So looking at human relation to each other and to the earth. Another definition is that it's a movement drawing from the green or environmental movement and feminist movements. And it sees the patriarchy, which is a system of society where men hold power over women, as the reason behind exploitation of women. So looking at exploitation of nature and the environment and exploitation of women. And you'll notice in the zine, I don't know if we talked about this in here yet or not, but women with an X. Does anybody know why somebody would write it that way instead of, Sydney? Yeah, for me it kind of represents in one term not just cis women, at least that's the way I interpret it. And there's also, if you look up the definition of why would someone do that, it's also a subtle way to not uphold patriarchal linguistic norms.
Takes the
So
man out of
it's
women.
man or men, yeah. Nick.
Could you write that? What do you mean?
Yeah, so I know my handwriting is not the best on here, but I feel like I definitely have it in here somewhere. But I'm a little bit out of it today, I apologize. So it's having an X instead of I can't do this. So if you spell it with an A or with an E, You know, so it's just like little things like that that are like holding. Yeah.
And it's kind of like that language dichotomy of like woman or male and female. It's like there's male and then there's other. There's man and then there's other. So it's just saying it's not like that's totally a patriarchal language thing.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we'll get into this in a second as well, but for me, like, troubling ecofeminism as, like, women, like, cis women or everybody else, and same with feminism and everybody else. Like, who are these movements for, and who do they include? And we'll get to that in a hot sec. But then the last definition I'd found is derived from Vandana Shiva's work, and is that ecofeminism addresses possibilities for changing these different intersecting oppressive structures. And so that's another thing that I like to focus on, is since it's questioning, hey, why are these things like this? It also addresses possibilities for change to make them not like this, to have the environment and not dudes not oppressed in the way that they are. So those are just some definitions I've found, but I invite you over the course of the day to like jot down words that stick with you or phrases. I talk kind of fast, which is something I'm working on, so if you need me to slow down or repeat something, please just ask me to. But yeah, over the course of right now, like kind of reflecting on what does it mean to you, and what does all of this that we're going to be talking about mean to you. So, related to that, if you look at the next page, troubling academic jargon. So something I hadn't really thought about, I did some work with ecofeminism last quarter, but hadn't really ever thought about how like academic and like ivory tower and like not accessible a lot of academic jargon is, and that totally includes ecofeminism. Like I hadn't heard of the term until last year. I took a class with Kate Darby where like she did a section on it, but like I hadn't actually ever heard that term, and I was like, whoa, I had never thought of it that way. But I still had been exposed and like to a lot of different not dudes doing a lot of really cool things with the environment, but just like hadn't ever thought of it with that term. And so I think troubling kind of like how terminology can be empowering, like giving a label something can be empowering. You're like, wow, that's me, or like that's the work that I want to do. I'm really excited about that. But also like there are also people doing that work already that don't even know that term exists, and like it's not very accessible. A question I have for all of you, and it's on the zine, is like, what do you do about the use of academic jargon and like terms that aren't accessible to everyone? Like people that are actually doing this work might not even know this term exists. You know?
I thought a lot about that in reading the papers last night, of like having been exposed to this kind of academic writing before, like it was, but just not making that assumption that not everyone has. But then within the paper, within the LaPaperson article, that they were talking about in the example of the conversation that the students were having, where they were doing that role playing, they were talking about how like they're theorizing out of experience, and like that they might not have the same, like they talk about that exact same thing, but then it was the contradiction. There was another layer, because then it was in this paper that was like theorizing that was also kind of maybe not accessible to everyone, or like takes that muscle of like learning how to read something like this and making sense of it, but just that there's layers of that, and that like people theorize out of experience all the time, and that like for me, just noticing this.
And I know some people don't operate the best with like being thrown a question and then having to answer it right away. So we're gonna take about like a minute or two if you want to like reflect and write an answer in your zine. Yes, Rose. You said you have a question? Oh yeah. I jotted down, but I don't know if you can read my handwriting. It's, what do you do about the use of academic jargon or like terms that are not accessible, like ecofeminism? So like, I don't know. Okay, I have a little story that might explain it a little bit better. So I emailed Fairhaven professor Jennifer Hahn about like resources for ecofeminism, and her reply kind of hit this kind of troubling the use of jargon or like terms like ecofeminism. So her reply was, we need a language that we can all relate to from our hearts, not just our ivory tower ways of studying the world. She said, "Let me tell you a story. When I was a Huxley Fairhaven student, I was sitting on the Greyhound bus next to a woman in her 50s. She said, 'What are you studying?' And I said, 'I'm studying environmental paradigm shifts.' And she said, 'I hope you learn to talk in common English too.' And she said, 'That, Jordan, is half my point. We really risk losing a lot of heartfelt connection when we toss around terms. A lot of people in the Salish Sea would have no idea what we're saying.'" So kind of just troubling that, and like, what do you think the place of jargon and labels are? Yeah. Does that make a bit more sense?
Yeah,
Okay, cool. So yeah, we'll take about a minute. No? You already did. Okay. And also, like, the whole point of a lot of questions we'll be thinking about today is, like, there's not going to be, like, a right answer for this, but it's more just, like, thoughts that you have and, like, to get you to start, like, troubling these questions. Rose really wants you to go.
Okay. I was kind of thinking about one way we could do this, or how to try and clear up some of this really academic language, is to try and convey your ideas as you are talking to your friends, and not like you're trying to defend a master's thesis.
Right. Yeah.
Because it doesn't really get us anywhere to try and convey these ideas with these big, like, very intellectually like stimulating words, if no one really understands what the hell we're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. So you're more like colloquial, just like you're talking to your friend instead of your professor.
And sometimes I find that a word, even though it's big, it might be the right word. It might articulate exactly what I'm trying to say. And that's good. That's people using vocabulary, but I also definitely catch myself with sort of this like ego trap. It's like I'm so afraid that people won't respect what I have to say that I feel like I have to like present myself as somehow like, and I think that like fear and that like, you know, intellectual sort of shield that people use is what, stops these conversations from being really real and authentic, and also make people feel like they can't participate in discussions that they very well could because they feel like they can't use hide my language. So I try to talk to people with my friends.
Dr. Case?
That it's a both and. So sometimes I feel like I have another degree in code switching, and I think for particular folks, we can speak multiple languages. And so I speak with my parents in a different way than how I speak with my friends and how I speak at work. Because I work in a profession that demands that I adopt, or at least can speak this language, because otherwise it would be a barrier. Particular folks will not have access to be able to have these conversations if we didn't sort of play this game, which is problematic. But also that there are these big words that help, that are created to help explain particular things. But that's where the code switching comes in handy. Because I feel like I can talk about this, any of these articles, with like somebody from the neighborhood.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
I saw your hand first.
Okay. I was gonna say that opening up the conversation to questions would be really helpful too, just like clarifying questions. I tend to use that a lot now when asking things, like, like just clarifying what you meant by that kind of thing. It helps make it more accessible to everyone, and also kind of clears up any misinterpretations.
Yeah. And also something that I'd been reflecting a lot with this was like, again, going back to the code switching and like, what group are you talking with and who are you talking with? And also if it's a group where you feel like they might end up asking clarifying questions, like add in definitions after you use a word, so that, because I know sometimes I don't feel comfortable asking a question. So also keeping that in mind too, for sure. Yeah.
I wrote, reach common ground by using common language, and that jargon can be a way of keeping oppressed people oppressed.
Rose, did you have something?
I've been thinking a lot about how does language inform our reality, and like if like even our common language and like what is our common vernacular and how does that inform our perspective of what reality is, and how if you change the language then there's a whole different reality in a way. And just sort of thinking a lot about that idea that our words create our reality, and which, like, depending on which language you use. And
It's very post-structural.
I was just going to bring up the term post-structuralism. There's this jargon term, post-structuralism.
Another jargon.
It's funny though, because the idea of post-structuralism is it's sort of, I think there are roots in ecofeminism, or feminism and ecofeminism have relationships with post-structuralism. Structuralism demanded this intense rule-making hierarchy of things. And what I lament about, and what I think post-structuralism helped me remind me, is that most human cultures, most language cultures, even if they're not human, are oral. And it's really recently that our vocabulary has just dropped off the face of the earth. We have like 1,000 words in our brains that we can use, and not 100 years ago, in Western culture, even like Lincoln and whoever he was going up against, had a 6-hour debate that the public went and like listened to and heard and knew what they were talking about. Or if you think about the Coast Salish culture and the number of words they have to describe things that us Western people can't even see the veneer through, we're blind to it, is so complex. And so I think that I lament, I worry, and I'm sad about how in our world we don't celebrate the complexity of words. And sometimes we do this by defining them. A definition also is a misogynist, hierarchical orientation where we take a word and we say, this is what it means, and it is only in this landscape that it can exist, rather than considering that there are multiple meanings to words, or multiple orientations or understandings of it in a more clear way.
Right. Instead of like, this is this one thing, that's all it is.
It again made me think about this idea of like land education and how like land is poetic and land has language, and that like there's a certain, like, kind of what Sky was saying is that I notice in like academic like all these real higher ed spaces, it's there's like such an ego attached to it, and it's like void of compassion and void of like feeling like the people, like there's very few classes where I feel like people actually are trying to convey information instead of just like this masturbatory like self-ego of like, oh, I'm talking about this thing, and like that excludes like what this article is talking about. Like this land already has so much language and so much to offer, just in like a different, a different dynamic form, that like when we're up here it like isn't accessible, and that like it totally is just this hierarchy, and that like I just feel like there's this general, it's like not a nice, like why, like how can we like have these conversations and like hold compassion with each other that we're all like learning, and like that it's all like when people just like assert things as being like absolutely true, and they're like, this is what this means, and like there's no argument and they're right, and it's like angry and like ego driven, that there's probably could be a lot from like thinking about just the mannerisms in which we like talk to people, and like how we talk about what we know or want to share. Okay, one more and then we have to
Going kind of off that, I think I read this in Grading Sweetgrass actually. It's like the English language is very limiting because it's something like 70% verbs, or sorry, opposite, 70% nouns and only 30% verbs.
Right.
And we put all these words on different things, especially when you're talking about land, which kind of stems from us creating this ownership of everything. And I think sometimes we put these big words onto these feelings because we have a limited language almost in these, like, it's hard to express ourselves using just verbs, when in actuality, like, most things are verbs. We even think of like memories as a thing. I mean, a person, place, thing, or idea, like that's very much an action. but we look at it as just being an it.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for your contributions. So I started with that page because like just hold this in your mind as we talk about the other things. Okay, so if you want to flip the page now, Salish specific tie-ins. So yeah, I know my like column was titled Ecofeminism and Salish, but it's more like ecofeminism, kind of troubling that, digging into that. Okay, cool. We're gonna speed up now, and we can talk more about this later. But so some different tie-ins I had. I also asked Jennifer Hahn about historical indigenous ecofeminism, which I started researching mainly last night, and I have a reading list that I'll give you after this with some great stuff on it. But also kind of thinking about who even identifies with the term feminist, and like since it's a very exclusive movement, like who wouldn't even feel, wow, Johnny, you shaved your face. That was so distracting.
What overtone? Wow, Johnny.
Wow.
Looking good.
But sort of like thinking about who does or doesn't subscribe to these labels and why somebody wouldn't feel included in that or wouldn't feel like that label includes them. And so something I started thinking about last night that kind of, Rose did this earlier, was like, whoa, like thinking about lots of things, kind of did that for me, was the term feminism itself continues to be debated in tribal communities, and some reject the term, and other indigenous women qualify their feminist politics with the more appropriate term indigenous feminism, just because like the whole idea of feminism patriarchy is tied to like settler colonial power structures, and so they're like, I don't even like, that's not even me, you know. And so yeah, I don't know, just thinking a lot about that and thinking about, so then I was looking up like in like historical indigenous ecofeminism, and like there are a lot of indigenous not dudes doing really great work. Like I wrote down Catherine Bridgham so she became a founding commissioner of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and so like there's great work going on, but they don't necessarily identify with the term ecofeminism, and I think that's really something to consider. But also then I was troubling like, well, since our like this land, like, okay, so I wrote down a lot of inherent ecofeminism is happening in indigenous communities, but bringing up the point of like, Jennifer said that a lot of women tribal members, like the work that they do is already ecofeminist, like from our settler colonial like viewing of that word. And so thinking about like what we think of as patriarchy, and therefore feminism is also inherently tied with colonial and settler ancestry and power dynamics. I know I just threw a lot of words at you, but that was kind of what I was getting at with like also troubling those labels and those movements and how they connect. But then if you do want to think about it from like a lot of people, if you would throw out the term ecofeminism from that standpoint, Nick sent me a couple resources. One was the Salish Girls Leadership Program, SSGLP, and so that's like a youth organization that has a subsect, now thinking about that as well, of like a girls leadership program, and also like the label girls and who's included in that and who's not. And I was like, look them up on Facebook, and they have an event that's like, this is a gender inclusive night, and they have like a specific event for being gender inclusive, and also thinking about that. So there's just a lot of things to trouble. Yeah, but the Salish Girls Leadership Program. And then also thinking about women leadership in Pacific Northwest environmental groups, led by not dudes, but also thinking about not merely, but being in that leadership role, like is that enough? Like if your organization is still holding up settler colonialism and white environmentalism, like is that enough? That's kind of what I was thinking about last night. But I did have some organizations. I know I'm rushing through this, I'm sorry. But Rain Coast, if you want to